Ways and Means and the District 9 City Councilor. Today is Monday, June 24th, and we are here with our friends from BPS and the Budget Office to discuss dockets 0968 and 0969. Message and order approving a supplemental appropriation of $12,037,969 to cover the FY19 cost items contained within the collective bargaining agreement between the Boston School Committee and the Boston Teachers Union, Local 66, AFT-Mass, AFL-CIO. The term of the contract is September 1, 2018 through August 31st, 2021. The major provisions of the contract include base wage increases of 2% in September of each fiscal year. Docket 0969, message in order to reduce the appropriation for the reserve for collective bargaining by $12,037,969 to provide funding for the Boston Public Schools for FY19 costs contained within the collective bargaining agreement between the Boston School Committee and the BTU. These matters were sponsored by the mayor and referred to the committee on June 19th. I'd like to remind folks this is a public hearing being broadcast live and recorded on Comcast, Channel 8, RCN 82, Verizon 1964, and streamed on the City of Boston website. I'd ask folks in the chamber to silence their electronic devices. We will take public testimony at various points through the hearing process. There's a sign-in sheet to my left by the door. Ask that you state your name, residence, any affiliation, and check the box yes if you wish to testify. And I'd like to just welcome in order of their arrival my colleagues. To my far left, Councilor Ed Flynn. To my immediate left, Councilor Matt O'Malley. And to my immediate right, Councilor Anissa Asabi George. And we are here to discuss the City of Boston School Committee's contract with BTU and the City of Boston. Thank you, and I'll hand it over to Justin. Thanks, Justin.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Councilor Shomo and others for inviting us here to testify today. As you mentioned, my name is Justin Starrett, and I'm the Budget Director for the City of Boston. We are here to offer testimony on the two dockets before you today and the appropriations they reflect. I am also joined by my colleagues from the Boston Public Schools, who I will allow themselves to introduce when they speak later. Dockets 9068 and 9069 are appropriation orders that cover the FY19 costs of collective bargaining agreements between the Boston School Committee and the Boston Teachers Union for $12 million. As you remember, the FY19 budget passed by the council included $38.4 million in aggregate to cover the collective bargaining reserve for FY19. So far in FY19, this is the 15th and final supplemental collective bargaining agreement of the year. The council has previously passed appropriations for Teamsters, Park Rangers, Municipal Police, Firemen, BPS storekeepers, PHC programs, BPS Admin Guild, and a whole host of others. With the approval of this supplemental, the remaining FY19 balance in the collective bargaining reserve will be $1.26 million. And following the completion of this contract, the city will have settled agreements with 90% of unions between the city, BPS, and PHC. I'm going to turn it over to Emily to walk us through the highlights of the contract, but we from the Budget Office are happy to answer any questions about the financing, and I'll allow the experts to talk through the contract details. So, Emily.
Good afternoon. My name is Emily Kuzelbush. I'm the Chief Human Capital Officer of the Boston Public Schools. We're here today to give you an overview and then answer questions about a contract that was ratified by the Boston Teachers Union and then voted on by the Boston School Committee last week. As you probably know, the Boston Teachers Union represents about 8,000 members, and at a current cost of about $600 million and about 2/3 of our budget, it's the single largest expense in BPS and one of the largest in the City of Boston. More importantly, this contract represents the single largest tool that we have for improving student achievement. It lays out the rules and the constraints under which our schools operate in pursuit of that goal. It's a set of rules under which each of our 125 unique schools must operate. It outlines everything from how many minutes in a row that a teacher can teach to what qualifications we can ask that educators bring to the classroom, to how much professional development that we can require members to participate in. We know that this negotiation is a core component of a district strategy for student achievement, and we bring you a contract today that we believe makes good on that incredible responsibility and is good for students and fair to educators. There are 3 key things that we want you to know about this contract, and then we're happy to dig into any of the details or questions that you have. Number 1, this contract is student-focused. The process of negotiations was all about finding shared interests with the BTU in support of doing right by students. This contract provides additional supports for English learners, students with disabilities, students living with poverty and homelessness. The contract here on nurses, mental health providers, paraprofessionals for kindergarten classrooms, class size for our sheltered English immersion students, and inclusion supports represents places where we were able to find common ground with our bargaining partners. Number 2, it focuses costs responsibly. This contract will add more than $108 million in cost to the district over its life. We've talked over the past few years about ensuring that we're spending our resources strategically, and we believe that this contract does that. Number 3, it achieves a number of flexibilities that will empower school leaders to respond to the needs of their students. These items are not headline grabbers. Our strategy going into the negotiations was to focus on small but important restrictions that school leaders told us were tying their hands. This includes a modification to the cap on consecutive teaching minutes, a suspension of building-based attachment rights for teachers who are hired after a year in suitable professional capacity, and streamlining paraprofessional staffing processes to ensure a quicker turnaround on hiring. Today, we present to you a contract that's good for students and fair for educators. This contract centers on students and focuses cost responsibly and achieves key flexibilities for school communities. We're happy to talk through any of the details and answer any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Emily. I was just going to recognize Councilor O'Malley. And we've been joined since you started the presentation by, to my left, Councilor Andrea Campbell, and to my right, Councilor Kim Janey. I'm going to recognize Councilors Nisa and George.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you all for being here today. It's certainly, I think, very positive developments when we think about the impact that this new contract has had on the budget process that we've been undergoing the last few months here in the City Council. Of particular concern, I've got a number of questions I have about this new contract, what it means for our students, what it means for our school communities. Of particular interest is, first, the full-time nurses at all of our school buildings, those 44 schools with part-time nurse. I am thrilled that we will now be at full-time nursing at those schools, and hopefully we'll get to that point quickly. I know that there'll be some time to hire and to onboard that nursing staff, those nurses throughout our schools. Can we talk a little bit, though, about the mental health and behavioral health specialists, that additional 23 number? I understand it's broken up between licensed mental health professionals and then school psychologists. There's the 19 mental health providers, 4 psychologists based on student need. How are we determining student need, and how are we ensuring that they are student-facing?
Let me start.
We are actively working across departments right now to try to do that in as fair and data-driven a way as possible. So we actually just were in a central office meeting last week. We're getting school leader input to make sure that we do that as fair as possible. We'd welcome your input as we go through the process. We are focusing, for instance, on data we have available that we incorporated in the Opportunity Index that looks at factors related to childhood trauma to try to be as data-driven as possible.
Okay. And then student-facing, how are we ensuring that these positions will be student-facing? One of the concerns that arises whenever we have an investment in any sort of resources in our schools, that there's often this administrative role that gets tacked into it, and before long, we've got too many of the folks that we were expecting in school communities and central office. So just, I would like some reassurance that those 23 positions will be school-based positions.
Our intention is that all 23 of the positions are student-facing.
Right. And then there's also a note about the additional investment, $100,000 to combat student homelessness. Can we talk a little bit about that investment, and then can you tell me about the citywide commission to address student homelessness?
Yeah. I'm happy to talk about it. We agreed with the Boston Teachers Union that we want to support students in the situation, students who are living in poverty or students who are homeless. We agreed that we wanted to earmark this money, put it into the contract, and then take a reasonable amount of time to figure out exactly how it's used with them. So that's our intention.
And can you tell me about the commission?
Same thing. We knew that there, and we had talked with our partners at City Hall, we knew that there was interest in that. Boston Public Schools alone is not going to solve or even make a dent by ourselves with the issue of students who are homeless. So we want to work with city agencies. So that you'll get more details on that, and we'll loop you in as you're interested.
Great, I look forward to that. We do have right now, which I'm a part of, the Family-Led Stability Pilot, which is an effort that is a collaboration between my office, the mayor's office, D&D, BHA, Boston Public Schools, and the effort is around creating housing opportunities close to school, focused on a number of our schools, a handful of our schools in the district, and I wonder if that may be the most appropriate place to have some of that collaboration and that partnership.
We should collaborate. We should not duplicate efforts. So that makes sense to connect to you about that.
Great, thank you, I appreciate that.
Yep.
That's it for me this round.
Thank you. Councilor Campbell.
Sorry about that. Thank you, Councilor Siomo, and thank you guys. And it's not easy, obviously, negotiating with any union and getting to an agreement in a proposed contract. So appreciate the hard work by each and every one of you, and of course, your teams who are not sitting here as well. I'm just curious if we could elaborate just a little bit more on the nurses and how that process is actually going to work in terms of rollout. And the same thing with mental health providers and psychologists. I did hear Councilor Sabi George's question as well. Very important, obviously, an issue that many councilors have been talking about, including some of our predecessors, for a really long time. So be curious to know a little bit more about the rollout and process with respect to that.
Do you want me to? I'll start and then turn it to my colleagues. So specifically with nurses, our goal is to add capacity without disrupting what schools already have in place. So for example, if two schools have a part-time nurse that they're very happy with, we don't want to just disrupt that to make another school whole. So we're spending the next couple weeks, the next couple months figuring out how to add capacity as quickly as possible while being thoughtful. I don't know if anybody up here has anything they want to add or shift.
It's obviously a big investment, and we want to make sure that it's being done right. And so one of the early conversations we had as we moved to the implementation phase was around the timing of it, and sort of seeing this is when we need to have this done by, this is when we might be able to have it done by, and trying to find the right sort of equilibrium between those 2 points to make sure that, as Dr. Kozlowitz said, making sure that we're not being disruptive to school communities, and also making sure that we're being thoughtful with regard to our hiring and trying to advance all of our different recruitment and hiring objectives, and making sure that we've got the right people in place in the right school communities. And I would say that's true for both the nurses and the mental health professionals. To Eleanor's point earlier, that it's certainly the intention that all of these be student-facing positions, and making sure that it's done in an equitable way across schools.
And the goal is, for example, for the nurses, to get to this minimum school nurse, to get to that by what point?
Oh, no, that's fine. Well, I would say as soon as possible, given the qualifiers that I mentioned earlier about making sure that the positions will be posted, and we'll start the process, and hopefully throughout the course of the 1920 school year, we can get up to a full complement.
But it sounds like this pieces still need to be worked out in order to actually get to a firm date or timeline when every school can expect to see at least a full-time nurse. Like, we can't say, for example, starting in September, that every school is going to have a full-time nurse in their building.
No, I would say the firm timeline is actually in the contract, so that's in the 2021 school year, but it's certainly, we're going to move as expeditiously as we can.
Thank you guys for that. In the beginning, Emily, you were talking about just some of what the contract does, and, so after, just got this, have to look at this, but what it does for our special needs students, English language learners, those, of course, in poverty, dealing with homelessness. I'm curious if you could elaborate on special needs students, English language learners, what that is, and to the extent you can share, I'm curious also, what were some other asks that we just didn't quite get to, that we did see as needs for those students, but maybe did not make it into this contract?
Sure. In the area of inclusion, we spent most of the 18 months talking with the Boston Teachers Union about our inclusion classrooms. Those are classrooms that are intentionally comprised of students who have IEPs, individual education plans, and students who do not. It is a wonderful model that, when done right, allows for all students to reach really high levels of student achievement. They're really, if you see inclusion classrooms done right, they're really nurturing places where kids are learning from each other and are really supported to reach high standards. We shared the interest of strengthening our inclusion programs with our BTU partners. We did not always share the actual solutions. We didn't have the same ideas for how to solve it all the time. We agreed that we want to spend more time on working together. So we have signed a memorandum of understanding with the BTU. Incoming Superintendent Dr. Caselius was very specific that this is one of her priorities to get right. So we will spend the next year digging in to figuring out what are the challenges we're facing and how are we going to solve them. That said, we did agree to a number of provisions in the contract to strengthen the supports that teachers who are teaching in these classrooms have, and thus students have. One of those is that well, two things we were already doing, but we codified in the contract. We will not have higher than 50% students who have IEPs in any one classroom. Secondly, in classrooms where we have a teacher who, we have students who also need supports because they are learning English, we will provide an option for having an additional teacher push in to deliver the services to minimize the number of essentially licenses that a teacher is using. So we did put some supports in place in the contract, and we agreed that this is a shared problem that we want to solve together over the next year.
I heard the buzzer. I can wait for the next one.
Thanks. Counselor Janey.
Yeah, I'm not using that one. Good afternoon. Thank you all. I just want to follow up on some of the questioning from Councilor Campbell, starting with the nurses. So what can we expect for this next school year? How many of the nurses will come in this next school year versus the school year after? Are we hoping to get to 100% in this next school year? I guess that's my bottom line question.
I can answer this one. We want to hire as many high-quality nurses as quickly as possible that we can. So if we haven't already posted the positions, we will be doing so very shortly. Our nursing team is working very hard to get as many positions filled as possible. As you can imagine, hiring 22 or 23 new employees in this amount of time is a tall order, and we want to make sure we do it well because we know these staff will be with us for some time. So the nursing team is looking at student need, acuity of health needs by school, and will be prioritizing the schools where they believe acuity is highest to make sure that if we don't fill every one of the new positions by the first day of school, that the schools that need them the most have them first, and then our work will keep going after the first day of school. I am hesitant to commit to a number. I'd be thrilled if we can find enough high-quality nurses for the first day of school, but we do want to make sure that we're responsive to the quality of candidates that's available in the market as we go forward.
So in terms of the number of schools then, you have the list? You said you have a list of the schools with the highest needs?
Yes. Not with me, but I know the nursing team we've gone through a detailed spreadsheet. We know every school that has a 0.5 versus a 1.0. We have some schools that have been paying the remainder from their own budget, so that immediately becomes paid for through the central office, and the school frees up additional resources for the school. There, we don't have a hiring need, and we're prioritizing. And I'm sure this is something we could follow up with if you are looking for more detail.
Yeah, and as you look at that list in terms of where the need is for nurses, I'd be interested in that broken down by zip code and by city council district. If we switch, though, and looked at inclusion, Emily, and so you talked about inclusion done right a couple of times in your presentation. In terms of staffing, what does that look like to you?
It's different depending on the model, depending on the school, depending on the community, depending specifically on the students in the classroom. And that is where we spend the majority of our months. When you write contract language, you are, by necessity, writing rules that are going to fit all 125 schools. What we know about the inclusion programs that are done really well, that people hold up, the Mendel, the Henderson, the Manning, there are lots of schools that do this well. They look different, and sometimes they're using one teacher with a para. There are some schools with two-teacher models. There are schools that tried the two-teacher model and found that they'd rather use their resources differently. What we attempted to do was to find kind of what conditions would we want to codify in a contract, given that we were in a negotiation and that this really mattered to the BTU to get codified in the contract. And then to recognize that the vast majority of the questions that we have are ones that Dr. Caselius would prefer to work through over the course of a year with a working group.
Mm-hmm. And so one of those points of discussion that there's now agreement in is the percentage of the number of children with special needs that would be in an inclusion classroom?
Yeah.
And is that the 50%?
Yes.
And is it up to 50%?
It will not exceed 50%, yes.
So it's up to 50%.
Up to 50.
So what we don't, it could be 30%.
Yes, yes.
And then do we talk about what types of needs, though? In terms of whether these are needs that require a lot more in terms of adults in the building or resources in the classroom versus fewer?
In the contract, I do not think we do. Is this an area you want to talk about?
So how then do we protect ourselves in ensuring that students with the greatest needs are not concentrated in some classrooms and getting up to that 50%, and then in other classrooms or in other school buildings, we see children with fewer needs maybe getting up to that? It's just going to look very different to your point.
Yeah.
I would say two things in response to that, because I think it's a very good question. So the 50% threshold that is now in the contract is for all students on IEPs. Already in the contract prior to this agreement was a restriction on the number of high-need students in a particular class. That restriction hasn't changed as part of this agreement, but there is the 50% threshold. That's distinct from the issue of where programs are concentrated in particular schools, which I think is an ongoing challenge that the district needs to address, and that we have some inequities with regard to having disproportionate concentrations of programs going into particular schools, and that's something that both as part of the Build BPS process, and I'm confident as part of Dr. Caselli's strategic planning process over the course of the next year, is an issue that we'll have to take a very, very close look at.
Thank you. In terms of areas where we could do much more, this is my last question, thank you, Mr. Chair, do much more in terms of increasing opportunities for students when we talk about equity. So whether we're talking about the work to increase our teaching force, the work to expand access to our exam schools, the work around doing more for dual language, creating more dual language opportunities in our schools. If you could briefly talk about those as my last question, and then the second round I can go into a little more detail. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. As to how we expand access?
Yeah, the investments in this budget, so for folks, I think some of the other folks on the panel may be familiar with the questioning, because these are questions that I've asked over the last 18 months around how we are creating more opportunities and more access to our exam schools. what work are we doing to increase diversity of our teaching force so that it reflects the diversity of our students, which is the stated goal of the Boston School Committee, as well as dual language. So creating more opportunities for dual language, and not just for English language learners, but for all students. You know, another dual language school, for example, or what is the plan over time to create more of those opportunities?
So the creation of the Office of Human Capital specifically 5 or 6 years ago is because of both the research and the data behind and the belief that school communities who select the staff for their buildings are going to be selecting teachers who meet the needs of their students. That includes teachers who look like the students. We've talked about this many times about the gap between the diversity of our teaching workforce and the diversity of our student body. The intention, since we're talking about a contract today, was to, wherever possible, allow for school communities to be selecting staff, because that's where we see diversity rates increasing. We were able to do that. We expanded the number of paraprofessional positions that are subject to hiring through mutual consent. This morning when we were presenting to school leaders, one of the first questions asked was, we're really excited about all the additional resources. Please tell us that we can select individuals and that you won't be placing them. That's the first way that I would answer your question in the context of a contract.
Yeah, and to the degree that the question encompasses the overall budget, there's some specific strategic investments that have been identified, including the $750,000 to the lower performing schools and the costs associated with the switch on the ISEE that are meant to hopefully expand that type of access. But certainly happy to expand upon those answers.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councilor O'Malley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you on to getting us to this point. I apologize, I had to step out, so you may have gone over some of these, but can you talk about, does the wage pattern in this contract differ from any recently bargained contracts? Maybe that's probably for Justin.
Sure. I would say it largely follows the pattern, with the lone exception that as BPS and BTU continue to discuss parameters around really 3 things. I'll let them get into the details. There is a possibility to increase the general wage pattern by 0.5% in either year 2 or 3. There's obviously that's a little bit different than how the vast majority of other unions in the city were negotiated with, but there's actually a tremendous value in that benefit for the school that I will let them talk about, that it was certainly worth that part as part of the negotiation. Okay. I don't know if BPS wants to expand on that.
The IBB process specifically?
So the district and the union committed to an interest-based bargaining approach at the beginning of this negotiation, which both parties knew going in that it would be an extended period of time that we would be spending with each other. So over the course of those 16 or 17 months, there were a few issues that were identified as needing continued discussions. Some related to staffing, some related to leaves of absence, and a third piece related to a change in the state law regarding layoffs, teacher layoffs when those are necessary. And so those 3 issues have been moved forward and will be part of a continued IBB process over the next several months. And if mutual resolution is reached on those 3 issues, then that's what would trigger the additional 0.5% along with some other savings measures, which would be something that would be in the district's interest as well.
So it'd be cost neutral, you'd realize some savings?
No. So as part of the increase in the city's budget that we talked about this morning, there was a $5 million increase that would cover a portion of the 0.5. That is not the only thing that is in there. There are other things as part of that, but that would be a part of it.
Okay. And can you talk a little bit about if there's been any policy modifications as it relates to student or suitable professional capacity teachers?
Sure. Yes.
Again, I apologize if you went through this earlier.
No, we did not.
Good, perfect.
And it's well documented. It's one of my favorite topics, so I'm happy to talk about it. So we worked this contract negotiations and last to find some solutions to reducing the number of teachers who are in suitable professional capacity. This time we really focused on ensuring that strong teachers, proficient teachers in that situation are hired. So 2 contract provisions we have I believe will help us achieve that. First of all, teachers who have been in this position of SPC for 1 year, now when they are applying for jobs and get hired, we are suspending their building-based attachment rights. They still have tenure, which we call professional teaching, PTS, but the principal who's hiring them can essentially have them in the building for the year, hopefully, and we expect it will work out, and they can hire them back, and then they will have their attachment rights. But if not, they can access them at the end of the year. We believe that we have a number of strong teachers in this situation who will get hired, given this provision. The second provision that we negotiated was for any teacher who's been accessed from their building in February, when they no longer have a specific position at that building, if they apply to at least 5 positions, we will guarantee them 2 interviews. What happens every year when teachers are accessed, we have a large percentage of teachers who do not apply to jobs. The union...
What's a majority?
Well, at different points, it goes down, obviously, over time, but when I was in June, this is June, early June, June 1st, we were at about 45% of teachers had not applied to jobs.
Had not applied. Wow, okay.
So it's high.
Yeah.
So we want to incentivize them applying to jobs.
And how many teachers are currently in the excess pool?
Well, it's hard, so...
I know it's a fungible number, but...
Yep, so this year we had about 400 teachers who were separated from their position essentially in February, and we're down to about, I think we're at under 200, just under 200. Okay. So usually by the first day of school, we're around 100.
Okay. And has there been changes to performance evaluations for teachers as a result of this contract, or is it the same as has been?
We streamlined a couple things, but nothing significant.
Nothing manageable? Okay. I know Councilor Sabi-George has been doing some great work as it relates to sort of the homeless commission and addressing student homelessness at BPS. Has that been part of this sort of contract as well? Supports for getting a handle on numbers and supports for those students?
Yes, we dedicated funding to students who are experiencing homelessness. Councilor Sabi-George brought up the point that there are other efforts going on across the city. The intention is to collaborate and to think about comprehensive supports, and then specifically to hone in on ways that we can support kids in schools. So details to be coming.
Okay, fine, fair enough. Yeah. And then how many ABA or applied behavioral analysis specialists have been added to the bargaining unit or will be added to the bargaining unit as a result of this contract?
I don't have that at my fingertips. Let me see if the team happens to have it, we'll follow up.
But there, I guess I'll rephrase it. There is an increase, and there will be an increase as a result.
0 are being added.
Yeah, I don't
So
believe
there will
there's a
not be an
change,
increase,
change in the
okay.
compensation, but not a change in the total number, I believe.
Okay, fair enough. Thank you. That's all for now, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, we've gone around? Yeah, I'm good, thank you, I
Okay.
appreciate that.
Councilor Campbell?
Thank you, Councilor Siomo. Just a couple of questions. So how does this contract in terms of total cost compared to previous?
It's a little bit, sorry, I'll let them jump in. From a city perspective, it's a little bit hard because this is a 3-year contract versus a 2-year contract. I would say that the wage pattern fell pretty similar to the last contract. I would say they mentioned some of the new investments like nurses and the Cell-Well professionals who were not included in the past contract, so I think it makes it inherently a little bit more expensive, but generally falls pretty much in line with what we were planning for last year, but then also generally the wage pattern that was set by the rest of the city.
Do we have numbers of just this total contract and say the...
So the total
The
contract on
previous-
this one was $108 million. I don't have the 2-year contract or the last contract, which was a 2-year contract off the top of my head, but I
Eleanor.
can get you that information, or unless Eleanor
I
has
have
it.
this.
Oh, there you go.
Thanks,
If
Justin.
as Justin referenced, we're
Yeah.
at 108.8 for this 3-year contract. Our last contract, which was a 2-year contract, was 42.7 total cost. And the BTU contract that preceded that was actually a 6-year contract that was from FY11 through 16 at a cumulative cost of 156.
6 years, 156, FY11 to 16, and then it was a 2-year and
Yes.
3-year. Okay, very helpful. In terms of average teacher salaries, how does this compare to other districts?
The current average teacher salary in BPS is approximately $97,300. That's a figure that includes regular teacher stipends, but excludes benefits and pension. We have studied how our wages compare across the state of Massachusetts and across the country. We are proud to have a very high teacher salary in Boston. By some measures, we have the highest average teacher salary of large cities across the country, and there are a small minority of districts in Massachusetts have a higher average salary. We are higher than the vast majority, and the places that have a higher salary, it's due to having a more tenured workforce. We have been unable to find in Massachusetts a more generous wage scale.
Do you know the places with the more tenured workforce, where are those places? Just curious.
DESE publishes all the data, and I'd be
Yeah.
happy to share it. I don't know it off the top of my head.
That'd be
But we
great.
did look at the wage schedule for Boston and then drew a big circle around it, looked at all the surrounding areas, and we did this analysis about 2 years ago, and at that point, you would make about $16,000 more as a Boston teacher than you would at any of the surrounding districts for the same level of education and years of experience.
Very helpful. I'm also curious, and this is not, and I should probably preface this, sort of a knock on our teachers, because I know some who work at some of our schools but do not live in the city of Boston who are incredible teachers. But I'm just curious if we know the percentage of our teachers that live in the city of Boston versus living outside the city of Boston.
I don't know it off the top of my head. We could get it for you, unless anybody knows it. No, I don't know it.
And then I'm also curious, and I mean, this could tell us a little bit of that. I'm always curious, too, what percentage of our teachers actually send their children to Boston Public Schools. Do we know that? Or I guess you could look at if you live in the city of Boston or you don't. But I'm just curious
Yeah.
if that's ever been sort of tracked in any way.
I don't think, we do not track that. I think we would have to look at the percentage of teachers who live in the city of Boston.
And then just looking at, obviously, we're going to be going through a middle school transition at some point. And this has been a topic of discussion in many of our budget hearings as we go to K through 6 and a K through 8 model. We have standalone middle schools, which, with a question mark, including like the Timilty, where I went to school, was a great middle school. I'm curious, did that come up in discussions for our teachers? What does that mean? Because at some point, those schools will have to transition either to the new model that we're envisioning for our families, K through 6 or K through 8, or go offline in some way and transition those families to a school, hopefully, of their choosing, or a program of their choosing. So I'm curious, how might that affect our teachers, our professional staff? The question around how that affects families is a whole different question, but if it came up in these discussions and what that means.
It certainly came up in the discussions. I don't know that I could cite to a specific provision that sort of relates to it in the final agreement, but as I said, over 16 or 17 months, there are a lot of issues that came up, and there was I think a good constructive dialogue about. And some of the things we think about is as the configurations of school changes. What does that mean with regard to certification requirements and making sure that people are in the schools that they're qualified to be in, and how do we maintain the type of flexibility that we need to make sure that we have properly credentialed individuals in each school. So I think, like all of our grade configuration issues, it's sort of part of an ongoing process that we'll be revisiting frequently over the next several months and years.
That's very helpful. And I really appreciated you naming the difference between sort of inclusion and placement of students and not having higher than 50% of students with IEPs,
Right.
which is very different than those schools that have more strands around those with special needs who are serving either our most needy students or those who need more services and programming than others. That concentration is real. So I really appreciate you naming that and putting it into sort of the inequity piece, and look forward to working with you guys and especially our incoming superintendent on those pressing issues, particularly at the high school level. But just wanted to say thank you for naming that.
I would just say she's looking forward to working with each of you, as well as I think most of you know
Yeah.
from her meetings that she's had in recent weeks.
It's exciting. And going back to, and this is like sort of got cut out, oh, did I buzz?
No, you're the last.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Councilor Simo. Going back to the questions along the lines of, what you were working at, and there was still obviously a gap of understanding, but, everyone shares the same values around strengthening inclusion programs and some of the other things we're trying to do, including the union. But maybe the how is different and how you get there. I'm curious and I've heard this quite a bit too, for some, an inclusion classroom does not necessarily require that you have two teachers. Each school works differently. Some have different types of models. How might you design, and I guess this is possible, to design a contract in such a way where you have some level of flexibility for those schools or school leaders or those institutions to be able to design their classrooms in such a way that it meets the needs of their students and their families? And not just obviously articulated just by them, but having conversations, say, with the families of the folks in the room, or the lead teacher, for example, in the room, as to what they think their supports are.
Well, I think your question was, how do we design a contract to do that? And I think what I would say is sometimes you do that by keeping it out of the contract, that is what maintains that flexibility. And what I think we're encouraged by is Dr. Caselli's commitment, which incidentally was memorialized in a memorandum of understanding as part of this, this negotiation, to work with the teachers union and a variety of other stakeholders to identify what the best practices are with regard to these programming needs of students, and to develop a strategy and to maintain the flexibility that schools need to meet the individual needs of their students. And as I think Emily said earlier, that's what we've identified as what the way to get to best practices is to allow the people that are closest to the work to work together to develop the best way for schools to serve students. And the only thing I would add is just to go back to the point about the risk of when we memorialize more in the contract than we should. What we think about now as the best way to serve students with disabilities is not necessarily how we thought about it 20 years ago. And it's unlikely to be how we think about it 20 years from now, because in part because we learn more, in part because the needs of students change and evolve. And so in the contract, frankly, doesn't always evolve over time. That there's a lot of things in there, if you ever thumb through it, that they don't really make sense because they may have made sense in the 80s or the 90s or whenever these things went in. And we have a responsibility to make sure that we are preserving that level of flexibility so we can adapt and we can evolve as the needs of students change. So I think the short answer to your question is we have to always be thoughtful about what we address via the collective bargaining process and what we address as part of our ongoing work with our bargaining partners, but not necessarily memorialized in a contract.
And that almost goes to the other point around the nurses, which everyone was talking about for some period of time. And there were some counselors even on this body that said, maybe we can't get to a full-time nurse through the BPS human capital department. But given the proximity of some schools to our health centers or those that are nearby, some have been really creative in creating partnerships to try to make that happen, to fill a gap or a void. And what does that do? I'm not saying this is a bad thing, but your point is well taken. Some things memorialized decades ago.
It doesn't always work. Contractual language does not always breed creativity.
That's right. Thank you. This was extremely helpful. Thank you guys again. Thank you, Councilor Simo.
I just wanted to ask a clarifying question on the suitable professional folks.
Sure.
There's always been around 90 to 100 by the first day of school, or am I wrong?
You're correct, generally.
Right. So what language do you think is going to incentivize that we don't end up 90 to 100 by the first day of school? And what's the cost of that, Emily, through the
Sure.
school year? Yeah.
Right, and sometimes we're under 100, but we hover around 100. So there are two ways that number shrinks. One is strong teachers get hired. And then the other way is that teachers who are not as strong leave the system. And the leaving happens sometimes naturally when this happens and people need to apply to jobs. It's a little bit of a wake-up call. The vast majority of our teachers are teachers we want to retain. We have a very strong teaching force. We're talking about less than 1% of our teaching force. So you should not think that I think this about many teachers. This is a small percentage. So by exiting, some of that is on us through evaluation processes. Others are people choosing to leave and find other places to work. On the hiring front, this is step one. I do think we will see hiring teams, and I'll put this in air quotes, taking a chance in hiring an excess teacher. Strong, we hear this all the time from principals, strong, experienced teachers who have taught in BPS schools are gems, and they hire them quickly. The one thing that does give them pause is that once you hire a teacher who's been excessed and is permanent, you own them for life. And so this will give a little bit of an edge to those teachers. So I'm optimistic that we'll see the numbers drop because of this provision. In terms of budget, we are typical numbers are around 5 million. I'm looking at Eleanor. Generally, the number, even if it's near about 100 on the first day of school, it goes down over time, so that in June this year, I think we were around 52. I don't know if you have a good way to talk about the budget for that.
The total cost?
Yeah.
The budget available for this initiative for the last couple of years has been $7.1 million. And I think we are on track this year to repeat what's been true for the last 2 years, which is that we've come in under budget on the order of $1 to $2 million. I think it's one and change of savings versus the budget. That figure I just gave you is for salary. We pay for benefits on top of that for another $2 million.
Which is like a 25-30%.
Yes, $2 million on top of the 7.
Right, gotcha.
So a total of 9.
Right, and although it's 1%, which is a, pretty
Yeah.
small margin of error
Yeah.
for any calculation, is still 7 million.
We agree.
Potentially, yeah.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Well, great. Anybody else? Yeah, Councilor Campbell?
Just one last question. On the total, and if you don't have this, this is fine. In that comparison of this contract and the previous one that was 2 years, and then before that 6 years, is there a breakdown as to what the percentage of those costs are? So how much of that contract total number is going towards some of these student supports for teachers, sort of that first bucket, Emily, that you were talking about, those substantive changes in the classroom, and then how much are going to teachers' salaries and then to something else? If we could have that breakdown, that would be helpful.
I have some rough estimates at my fingertips, and we can follow up with more if you're interested. Give me just a moment. So one of the things that's nice about our current contract is that 23% of the total cost of the contract is for what we would call new costs, new services. That's where we put the nurses, the pairs for all the K-1, the homeless money, et cetera. That percent is higher than it has been in past contracts. So while the contract, if you compare this one versus the last two, is more expensive on an annual basis, as Justin referred to, it's more expensive because we're also in the contract paying for more additional resources for our schools. So the 23% in this contract compares to 5% in the last contract and 8% in the contract before that.
And then up the 23%, what, the leftover percentage, right, that 64%, what is that?
73. The 73% is to wage increases.
Yes, that would be 70. Thank you. Say that again, Eleanor.
So
That
the
would be
77% is wage increases. So it's for the employees who are currently in the employ of the city of Boston, wage increases.
Got it.
I think, can you clarify, of the entire school department budget, what percentage is human capital or teachers and staff and support?
The BTU contract is approximately $600 million of our general fund budget. So that's roughly half of our budget is in, a little more than half, the salaries. The figure I just gave excludes benefits. And so, obviously by the time you add the benefits on and then you add the salaries of non-BTU, I believe our total personnel costs are somewhere in the ballpark of 75% of our budget.
Pretty consistent over many
Yeah,
years.
but I'd have, to get precise on that,
Yeah.
roughly 75, I would need to dig into our files.
But I just recall that that's pretty consistent over
Correct.
many years.
Well, and Emily in her opening statement talked about the fact that this is the single biggest item in the BPS budget. That is true at over half just for the salaries of the workforce, certainly.
Right, gotcha.
And just one last point is, and a question is, obviously, you guys from where you sit are looking to make a lot of substantive changes to move the system in a certain direction for certain students, particularly as you see an increase of certain types of students with special needs or newcomers, you name it, the list is long. I'm curious and maybe this is a figure that could be pulled from just the negotiating conversations, what you thought the cost would be for some of those substantive changes. So for example, if the how worked out for you for inclusion and what you want to do with inclusion and what you want to do with, say, special needs students, what would that cost us? I have no idea. That's why I'm asking you. I have no idea. I mean, people talk about we'd love to do this, you can go to different schools, but what would that cost us?
So it's a difficult thing to speculate on, in part because, as we said, we want strategies developed closer to the work itself because we think that's what serves student needs first. I mean, there are all sorts of different ideas, and what I would say is that when we look at costs, we have to look at it both like what is sort of the baseline cost if we were to make a change, and then if we're going to make that change in an equitable way, like what is the sort of ripple effect? And sometimes there can be sort of echo costs that come, and so for that reason it can get pretty complicated. So it would be difficult for us to sort of put a specific number on it, but I think that's in part why we want to avoid the rigidity of things being addressed in the collective bargaining forum, but it's not really appropriate.
That's really helpful because you think about, and I'm just using the nurses as an example because that is before us, what it might cost the system if a school partnered in some creative way with a hospital that was right next door. Who knows, right? It may not cost as much of anything, which is obviously a need that everyone wants to meet. And then in some other case, or some other school, for example, given the fact that they're not so close to a healthcare provider or one that has a capacity to serve that need, it might cost us something different to be able to meet that need for that family or that community. So that's helpful. It's just to think about as you guys are tackling, and particularly the new superintendent, all of these creative and innovative ideas to be able to do in various schools. The costs may differ, but the question is, where's our flexibility with respect to being able to act in different ways?
To maximize the resources.
Right. Thank you. And Councilor Seelman, thank you so much. Thank you,
Thank
guys.
you.
Counselor, David Bloom, our budget director, gave me the actual numbers that I was estimating in my head, and he told me 78% is salaries and benefits. Thank you, David.
Gotcha.
Hopefully my 75 wasn't too off.
Great, thank you. That concludes this hearing on dockets 0968 and 0969. Thank you for your time and testimony. This hearing's adjourned.